Welcome to Insurrection at the Capitol, Insights from a Former White Nationalist, presented by Furman University's Riley Institute. If you'd like to submit questions, please do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Students seeking CLP credit, please be sure to participate in any polls later in the program. Now, hear these words of welcome from Furman University Chief Diversity Officer Michael Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Insurrection at the Capitol, Insights from a Former White Nationalist, presented by Furman University's Riley Institute. Thank you to the Riley Institute for creating the opportunity for this conversation with Derek Black, who has experienced a profound transformation in his worldview and work, thanks in large part to a sound liberal arts education. Participating in the discussion will be Furman professor Aaron Simmons, and three of our Furman students, Kwame Bethea, Catherine McCann, and Ingrid Ramos Rivera. Tonight's events occur within a much larger portfolio of Riley Institute work focused on helping point out and address systemic racism, not only in these speaker events, but also in other work across South Carolina. Last September's three-part Voting in America series, the 10th annual Straight Talk series presented in partnership with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, focused on the fight to vote for marginalized populations since the beginning of the Republic, including the current effort to disenfranchise people of color through restrictive laws and gerrymandering. This year, Straight Talk will be focused squarely on racism in America. This continues in a line of thought born with the very first Straight Talk event in 2010, which traced the long history of civil rights in America. Other Riley Institute work helps address the systemic roots of racism in South Carolina. Since 2003, the Riley Institute has been building a diverse network of over 2,400 leaders across South Carolina through its Diversity Leaders Initiative. This 5-month program brings together a diverse cross-section of highly placed leaders in an effort to think through complex issues of diversity within institutions and in the community. The Institute's work in public education across the state also is aimed at more equitable outcomes for all people of South Carolina. On Furman's campus, our work continues as we seek to address the wide range of issues connected to the university's commitment to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I invite you to visit Furman's website to learn about our recently launched strategic diversity plan. We welcome your thoughts on the plan as we are currently gathering additional input in order to be ready to begin implementation later this fall. Please contact me if you'd like to share your ideas. On January 6th, I, along with many of you, watched in horror as the attack on the US Capitol, a symbol of our representative democracy, unfolded. A violent mob desecrated the Capitol, endangered the lives of members of Congress, and attacked Capitol Police, all while displaying flags symbolizing white supremacist beliefs and conspiratorial nonsense. 2 months later, there are many unanswered questions and fears about future attacks on our democracy. We come together tonight to reflect on what happened and why. Our special guest this evening, Derek Black, was immersed in white supremacist doctrine from birth to early adulthood. Fortunately, Derek's story took an unexpected U-turn. Derek arrived at New College, a liberal arts college in Florida, certain that his worldview was the right one, and there discovered the extent to which it offended and harmed others. It was the students at New College who held Derek accountable, offering counter arguments to his firmly held beliefs, arguments that eventually led to his transformed worldview. Derek now consults regularly on anti-racist education for several organizations, including Facing History in Ourselves and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He speaks in these kind of venues, particularly to students, to share his experience and perspective. He is here tonight to offer his unique perspective on the groups at the core of the insurrection, white nationalists. To guide us through this important conversation is our own Aaron Simmons, a professor of philosophy whose scholarship focuses on political philosophy and the postmodern philosophy of religion. Dr. Simmons is highly regarded not only for his skillful handling of thoughtful discussions, but also for championing student inquiry and exploration. Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. Let me welcome you all to this event. On behalf of Furman University and the Riley Institute, we are so very glad that you are all here. I am a philosopher, and so I want to give just a few words to provide a philosophical frame for this evening. Democracy is unbelievably hard work. The philosopher Jacques Derrida goes so far as to suggest that democracy is always yet to come, because it requires that we never grow complacent, but continue to work toward it. Similarly, Emmanuel Levinas rightly reminds us that enacting justice is only possible when we remember that whatever we do is never just enough. More work always remains to be done. Thinking carefully about the insurrection of January the 6th requires that we interrogate not only our assumptions about others, but our assumptions about ourselves. As Ibram X. Kendi so aptly claims, the heartbeat of America is denial. It is wrong when we continue to say about the insurrection that this is not who we are. Only by admitting that this is very much who we have allowed ourselves to become can we begin to recognize in hope that it is not who we want to be. Yet, as Judith Butler suggests, giving an account of oneself is required because we are relational beings. Transformation is facilitated in a context of trust. Reconciliation always requires a framework of truth and repentance. Yet we find ourselves in a world of fake news, rampant conspiracy theories, the normalization of nativism, racism, anti-Semitism, and a vicious generalized fear of the other as a threat to one's own status and social conception. In order to continue striving for the democracy to come, we must recognize that unless we fight for truth, beauty, and justice, it may not be democracy that ends up coming, but something far worse. In that spirit, we would all do well to hear deeply the prophetic call issued by Amanda Gorman in her poem, The Hill We Climb. Quote, "If we're to live up to in our time, the victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made, that is the promise to glade the hill we climb. If only we dare, it's because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy, and this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us." Now, in awareness of the mantle of responsibility bestowed by those eyes of history, tonight we will be speaking with Derek Black. We will hear about his history and testimony of transformation in a bit. But first, it's important that we begin by recognizing that perspectives are always embodied and plural. The hope in this evening's event is not to privilege Derek's experiences and his story, but instead to hear it as one story among many that invite us variously to raise our own voices, stand in solidarity, step back and listen, and work together toward the democracy and justice to come in light of what might happen if we don't. The evening will proceed as follows. First, we'll watch a few images from the events of January 6th, and then hear from some Furman students about their experiences of that traumatic day. After the video, we'll talk with Derek as guided by questions from the audience, and conclude our time together by inviting our students back to join us live for a panel discussion about the topics that have emerged during the evening. Without further ado then, it is my honor to introduce you to three young people whose vision for tomorrow is inspirational for our conception of today. We will begin with Kwame Bethay, the current president of Furman's NAACP.
Whenever I first heard about the Capitol riots, I was actually at home. I had been watching CNN that morning, and I was watching the confirmation. I was listening to Senator McConnell speak and just listening to his speech about democracy and just our institutions and everything that we stood for as a country in America. And then to just see the camera pan to outside and seeing what was going on outside of the Capitol building, where we had our own citizens, American citizens, who were trying to delegitimize our entire presidential election and our system and our democracy and things that we hold near and dear to us that allow us to be who we are and that make us fundamentally American. That honestly hurt me because it's just something I couldn't believe. It's just something that I think we as Americans couldn't understand because we've never had to experience something like this, and it seems like we're just honestly living in two separate realities. We can't agree on what is fact, what is fiction, what sources of information are valid, and what sources of information are invalid. We can't agree on those basic fundamentals that make a country, wholesome and unity. We don't have any unity. We're so polarized that we can't agree on what our reality is. And I think that was just something that was really concerning to me. And I think I was shocked, but I don't think this was something that was unpredictable. I think if you were following President Trump's rhetoric leading up to the event, some of the things that Senator Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz were saying leading up to the event, I think it was just something that we could easily see that was going to happen. But it was just when it actually happened and when this actually took place on American soil, our entire Congress is inside of our Capitol with our vice president, and these people honestly went in there and tried to overturn a federal election. That was just something I couldn't believe that was happening, because that's just fundamentally un-American. That is not what we stand for, and that is just not what democracy is. So for me, looking back at that now, I just think there's so many questions that we have to answer. I think we have to do investigations. I think we need to see who was involved and honestly, how did we get here? And with so many Americans still believing to this day that that was justified, millions of Americans believing that that was justified, that concerns me because we're still not on par in terms of what we want. I think we have to figure out what we want our country to look like and what America really stands for, because I think what America stands for to some people is very different from what it stands for to others. And once we can get on one accord with that, I think we honestly are on track for moving forward into the future and building a better system. But until we can agree on what is the facts and what is the truth and what is the actual reality and what America stands for, I don't think that we're going to have any improvement. So I just hope that we can get ourselves and back to our traditional fundamental American values, which are brotherhood, fraternity, science, realism, just really get back to our roots and what really makes us American.
Good evening. My name is Catherine McCain, and I'm a sophomore biology and Spanish pre-med student. If you're on campus, you might see me involved with many activities, but most important to this conversation, the Furman Conservative Society, or FCS. My purpose here tonight, particularly as a leader in FCS, is to apply my conservative principles as we look back at the tragic event that took place on January 6th and take steps forward as a nation. Let me clarify before I begin that I'm not speaking for all conservatives. There will inevitably be conservative individuals who disagree with my viewpoints. Just like any other political ideology, conservatism is not one size fits all. It is, however, a tentative conservatism to hold high moral standards and to condemn what is wrong, in this case, violence, vandalism, and murder, and to uphold what is right, to preserve it, rule of law, freedom of speech, and peaceful protest. When the news alerts started buzzing in on my phone on January 6th, I didn't understand what was happening. I deleted the first few notifications without opening the articles at all. My digital calendar lit up to remind me of an internship planning meeting with Andy Coe, but neither of us could quite focus. We both got onto Zoom in a state of shock, tensing up every time we got a notification and pausing to read the headline. After the meeting, I turned on live coverage of the riot. I was seeing rioters on the House floor as congressmen and women hid in the gallery, and others tweeted assurances of their safety in undisclosed locations, and understandably expressed their fear. Hearing reports of threats to Vice President Pence, rioters in Speaker Pelosi's office, and Capitol Police being seriously harmed, Officer Brian Sicknick died in the hospital in the end. I sat with my heart pounding, praying for the cloud of chaos to clear and for the safety of our leaders, heroes, and fellow Americans. Strangely, after years of immense hostility, there was a sense of unity from afar with those being attacked at the Capitol, regardless of political ideology. Then I opened up Instagram and saw many posts in solidarity with the victims and defenders at the Capitol. I was also accosted with hot-tempered and hasty generalizations and equivalencies being made about conservatives, Trump supporters, and people of faith. I saw people posting that the Capitol Police should have treated those white rioters as police around the country have treated people of color. I saw others posting about how the people at the Capitol were actually Antifa members trying to disrupt due process and rule of law. Lastly, I saw an anonymous Furman account condemning Furman students with whom they disagreed. As I continued through my Instagram feed, I got swept up into a cycle of anger and bitterness, just like it seemed the rest of the world was at the time. And then I wept. I truly wept for our nation, for the hatred, for the confusion, for the frustration and lack of control in the situation, and for not knowing what to do. So I'm speaking to you today almost 2 months after January 6th, still not really knowing what to say that might effectively address the tension and division that seems to constantly underlie the politics of our nation. In fact, I'm not sure any one person can unite us. One thing that does seem clear to me is that the violence at the Capitol was wrong, unlawful, and detrimental to the protesters' cause. And at the same time, the lawful aspect of peaceful protest ought not be written off. As we move forward, we must hold dear our right to freely speak and peacefully protest, while also holding those who violated the law accountable to the fullest extent of the law, the very law that those attacked are responsible for creating. I'm looking forward to our continued discussion tonight in an effort to help answer some of the questions that we all have and find common ground that unites us. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ingrid Ramos Rivera. I'm a first-generation Mexican-American, and I'm a senior at Furman majoring in Spanish and Politics and International Affairs with a minor in Latin American Studies. Looking back at the events that took place on January 6th, I think of the initial emotions and thoughts that I had as I hopelessly scrolled past countless posts showing the violent actions of the insurrection. Like for many, for me, seeing the angry mob storm the Capitol was shocking. It was almost impossible to comprehend how such acts were occurring within a nation that praises itself for continuously maintaining and protecting its democracy. So upon seeing the jarring images on this day, I remember asking myself, how did we get to this point? Is this where our democracy ends? And where do we go from here? As I watched the news to see how things at the Capitol were unfolding, I remember growing frustrated and appalled by the situation. For one, it irritated me to see the lack of preparation taken to ensure adequate security at the Capitol. I questioned how it was even possible that the security level seen there did not equate to that used at the Black Lives Matter protest, mainly when the emotions and potential threats were ever more visible. Furthermore, it was alarming to see the influence President Trump was able to have on these rioters and the extent to which they were willing to go in their attempt to undermine the election results. Yet, it was more startling to see the lack of response shown by the former president, as the images of how the rioters were violently pushing their way into the building while wearing and carrying various types of gear and supplies were being displayed around the world. If more than anything, this lack of intervention showed me the lack of respect and understanding the former president has for America's democracy. So now that a few weeks have passed and various actions and decisions have occurred as a result of the attack on the Capitol, I fear that the repercussions for the heinous acts of January 6th have not been enough. It feels as if the consequences have not been representative of the severity of the situation, and those responsible have gotten away or have paid a fraction of the appropriate punishment. Thus, I question the stability of our democracy moving forward, and I fear if we will be able to learn the lessons needed to prevent future insurrections.
I would like to thank our students, those wonderful testimonies that they gave of the difficult experiences of that day, and welcome Derek Black to Furman University. I think this is the second time you've been with us, and we're really grateful to have you back with us again.
It's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So to start off, I want to throw you a question that maybe can frame why your experience is something that is relevant to these events and can help us think about a better tomorrow in a beloved community. But it's a sort of strange question, and here it is. What do you say to those critics who come out of the gate and say, look, what we need in order to create an anti-racist society is not to hear more white wisdom about how to live in it, but we need to hear from people of color. That the very fact that here we are, two white men talking together about how to be anti-racist, that this by definition misses something really important about what we're here to do.
I would say that I agree. And it's true. I can speak primarily for myself, but it has never been a very clear path for me to be confident in where my voice should be heard. I tend to say no to most things, actually, that I'm invited to. And in 2013, when I publicly condemned white nationalism, that was a conversation that had been almost as hard as the 2 years prior to it of dismantling all the evidence and coming to the point where I didn't believe it morally or factually. Speaking out against it was something that I did because I thought it was a moral imperative, but was the thing I least wanted to do. And then I spent years after that, 3 years, studying history, trying to not speak about anything in the contemporary news, much less on race and white supremacy. And it was really in 2015 and 2016 when I stopped turning down every request for comment, because I realized that in the same way, speaking in 2013, condemning the ideology that I had believed, that I had advocated and promoted for the first 21 years of my life, required that I speak against it. It was true now, just as it was true then. And I think that I have the same responsibility that we all do to speak against the evils that we see around us. If we want society to change, we have to speak against it. And there are definitely moments where that is required of all of us. And so I try to be cautious. I try to make sure that I am not speaking at an event for an institution that has not thought about its role in white supremacy. And I know that from talking to students and faculty that Furman has a long way to go, but I know Furman and the Riley Institute think a lot about their role in white supremacy, their role in broader society, their duty to students of color. And I trust the programming that is being put on here. And I also trust the faculty members and students that I've spoken with. I think that the wrong thing to do is to be showing up to an event replacing speakers of color or not speaking at all, and trying to thread that line is something that I think a lot about. And I think it's something that we all need to think about, that it is a moral imperative that we not be silent, that we not think it's not our responsibility, that if it's uncomfortable or if maybe you need to pass it on to someone else, like that is a moral failing as well.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the white moderates that Martin Luther King, condemned so vocally, where he says, it's one thing to say that you stand with me, it's another thing to say, but I'm not going to stand alongside you. And so I appreciate you being with us. In order to give some context to the questions that we're going to receive from the audience, many of them may not have read the book Rising Out of Hatred, which I certainly recommend. Eli did an amazing job putting that book together. The research is well done. The journalistic excellence is on display. And it's also a story about communities and relationships, about the breaking of a family, which he notes that your dad experienced. You're leaving this movement as almost like losing a son, the death in the family. So maybe what you could do is give a just a slice of that background, that history, in order for those who may not be familiar with who you are and what brought you to the transformation that occurred in college. Maybe just give us a kind of synopsis of that history so that people can catch up to where you and I may already be, obviously knowing more about that story.
Right. So I was born into one of the leading families that had helped build the white nationalist movement. And that alone, I think the audience needs to understand that white nationalism is not just an American movement, it's an international movement, and that it's a social movement. You need to understand it as a decentralized network of people who are connected, who talk to each other, who share information. And that's how you can distinguish white nationalism from what I think we might alternatively talk about white supremacy. If we're talking about racial injustice in our society, that's not exactly the same thing as the white nationalist movement, which has goals, which has nearly 50 years of history that its members are aware of. Its members are aware of their heroes, symbols, victories in the past, defeats in the past, and that has been accumulated over time. And my family had contributed to that in enormous ways, including running candidates for office. My dad's closest friend for his entire life was David Duke, who became notorious for winning a state legislature race in Louisiana and nearly winning the Senate and governor races in Louisiana as an open white nationalist. And so by the time I was born, they had spent decades building that. My dad founded the first white nationalist website on the internet in 1994 and built white nationalism online, bringing this movement together, tightening it up. And I completely believed the ideology. I believed its tenets that race is biological, that it predicts crime and intelligence, that there are hierarchies of groups, and this white nationalist belief that everybody in the world should be segregated into nations based on skin color. And then beyond that, an anti-Semitic conspiracy that is really foundational to all of it, that Jewish people are involved in an international conspiracy to promote civil rights and racial justice and immigration laws. And my family had worked for decades with this belief, and I advocated it. I organized online radio networks. I ran an AM radio show. I ran for office when I was 19 years old and won. And all that was true up until I went to college. I was already well known at that point. And after spending a little bit of time at this liberal arts college, I was outed, and it became an enormous controversy on the campus because they prided themselves on being committed to anti-racism and social justice. And the discussion was, how do we prioritize Black students, Hispanic students, Jewish students, people who my ideology was dehumanizing, and not try to make a white nationalist comfortable on our campus. And I came back anyway. I continued classes, and through quiet conversations at a series of Shabbat dinners over those years that I was invited to, my initial question was, where's the misunderstanding? If I believe that I am not harming people, if my family explicitly condemned violence and said that they were not responsible every time someone committed violence in the name of their ideology, then how am I culpable? And also dealing with the factual inaccuracies that white nationalists try to support their beliefs with pseudoscience from the 19th century, and they're abusing statistics. They're abusing crime and IQ and racial biology statistics to support something that's just unsupportable. And listening to those arguments, actually engaging in them quietly while a campus made it clear that I was harming people who I had come to care about, like that was the process that led me in the end to feel that not only was it wrong, both factually and morally, but that I had to speak out against it. I had to condemn it. And I've spent the years since then trying to figure out what is my role in being aware of this movement, understanding its adherents, understanding the kind of people that it appeals to, and at the same time wanting to take action against it, wanting to help our future be a little bit better than our past.
Thank you so much. And before we dive into conversation explicitly about the Capitol insurrections, we do have a question from Randy Clark in the audience that speaks very much to what you've just described. He says that he read Rising Out of Hatred, and he notes that clearly your friends in college were able to persuade you and to leave the hatred you were raised with behind. What guidelines then can you give the rest of us to help with friends or family or neighbors who might still be steeped in such white grievance? What would you say to Randy?
Right. There was one specific person who I met at these Shabbat dinners who engaged in the debates and the discussions with me. And the features of those conversations were that we genuinely cared about each other and we respected each other, that I engaged in good faith. And this is what they say all these years later, that if you're thinking about how you're going to have conversations, the first question you need to ask is whether the person you're talking to does respect you, whether the person you're talking to listens when you speak. And if you ask them to consider something, do they do it? Because that's rarer than we might like to admit. And the second is whether you feel safe doing that, whether it is a safe situation for you to be doing. And I don't mean to say that hyperbolically. This is a world that can be very unstable, and I don't want to be seen as somebody who's saying, have conversations with people who hate you, because number one, I don't think that's effective, and number two, it's very strange advice to give someone. But if you do find yourself in a situation where family member, a friend, a person who's living in the dorm next to you, which is what people in my college experienced, are willing to hear you, primarily in private, not in front of other people to try to score points in a debate, and are willing to ask you questions and then listen when you say it back, then you maybe consider that the role that you can play in that situation. And it's not going to be easy, because you cannot convince someone of something if they don't already feel that you understand what it is they believe. If you can't repeat back to them what their arguments are, even if you find them dehumanizing or awful to think, if you can't understand what they have to say from their point of view, then there's absolutely no way that you can engage, because just imagine if somebody's trying to change your mind on something that's core to you, it's absolutely key that they be able to understand you. It's very easy to dismiss someone who's trying to change your mind, who doesn't even understand what it is you believe. And before you're going into that, I think you should really ask yourself whether that's something you're comfortable with, whether that's something you're ready to do, and to realize what a difficult process it's going to be.
As we all learn, right, that embodied relationships are relationships where trust has to precede critique. Even though you make clear in the book, obviously narrates this, and in all your other interviews, you talk about the fact that those critical conversations and engagements also were accompanied by explicit condemnation, and that these worked together to create that sort of opportunity to rethink not just stuff that you thought, but who it was that you took yourself to be. So one of the questions that just came in that I think gets us into this space of how these ideas are relevant to the insurrection and relevant to what we saw play out on January the 6th. Jenna White is asking, to what extent did conspiracy theories drive the attack on the Capitol? And in order to answer that question, maybe you could also speak to the way in which white nationalism is more than just a sociological phenomenon. It's an interpretive lens. It's a way of seeing everything that one sees through a particular framework. And it seems that that's the way conspiracy theories also kind of get traction in our lives and become normalized. Maybe you could speak to the emergence of conspiracy theories and how that links to what we saw on the Capitol on January the 6th.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak specifically about white nationalism because this is the community that I was familiar with. These are the people who I grew up among and I knew, but it's deeply conspiratorial. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that because the issues that they talk about feel like politics. They talk about immigration, they talk about race, they talk about segregation, and these are some of the ugliest parts of our politics, but they're in our politics. I think the commitment to anti-Semitism stands out for some people as something that seems a little bit less normal in our culture. And so maybe the belief in a global Jewish conspiracy stands out as obviously conspiratorial. But I really would challenge people to think about this ideology sort of pan out and recognize that it's conspiratorial at its core. The belief that the elites, the government, are trying to harm us, or that immigration is not about opportunity, it's not about growing the economy, it's not about building a culture within America, it's not about all the things that immigration advocates actually list. It's about making you a minority, about making your family a threat, that immigrants coming are going to harm you. This worldview that there are threats out there that are waiting and that are being foisted upon you is fundamentally conspiratorial. And then finally, I'd say that white nationalism exists on a whole spectrum of other conspiratorial beliefs that I think stand out as more obviously conspiracies. Like there are people who I'm less familiar with, but I definitely bumped into, who believe that there are lizard people who live beneath the earth and telepathically control the minds of politicians. There are people who believe that the moon landing never happened. There are people who believe that UFOs crashed on Earth and the technology is being taken from these UFOs. And like, these are all belief systems that actively drive some parts of American politics, whether that is underground or mainstream. It was only, I think about 2 months ago, that there was a bombing in Nashville perpetrated by one of the people who believes that our politics is controlled by lizard people beneath the earth. Like, this is, if you're unfamiliar with it, it may sound outrageous, but I think trying to understand the undercurrents and the depth of conspiratorial thinking, which I'd say is really rooted in a sense of threat and a sense of your community being under threat, is something that has existed in American life for decades, if not centuries, but is driving a lot of the politics that we are experiencing as being chaos. Like the most obvious example is the Capitol attack, but I think we can see it in a lot of the instability that is showing up day to day.
One of the things that is fascinating about some of the sociological data concerning this sort of behavior, these traumatic insurrectionist sorts of vile behavior, is that it rarely comes from an abandonment of a moral commitment, but is actually rooted in what is taken to be moral certainty. So how is it that you see, this conspiracy theory logic, right? That we're locked into ways of viewing the world that then are resistant to objection. In fact, you commented often that the reason you weren't worried about going to the college you attended was because you were so certain that you were right. What do I have to fear? So how is it we can think about engaging with those who are not viewing what they're doing as evil or immoral or amoral, but a result of their moral commitments? How do you engage that kind of moral clarity, do you say?
I think that's a fantastic question, because it's really important that we recognize that nobody sees themselves as the villain. Nobody sees themselves as wanting to cause harm to lots of people. Nobody sees themselves as the evil person in a story. Everybody sees themselves as protecting their community, as under threat, as knowing something that everybody else is blind to, and only they're the ones who can see it. And I don't want to stretch the idea that it's conspiratorial thinking too far, because people believe things for all kinds of reasons, and it's maybe a little dismissive to say, oh, it's conspiratorial, because more broadly, I considered myself super analytical. I considered myself very reasoned and based in scientific evidence. And there's no point in my life where I would have said, no, nobody could possibly change my mind on the basis that I'm not open to evidence. I believe nobody could change my mind because I was just absolutely right, because I knew all the facts, and that other people were just not willing to look at the facts that I knew. And what changed for me was being a part of a community that was deeply hurt by what I was advocating, was deeply hurt, was dehumanized, when they would speak to me or would post on our public forum, would say how their lives were made worse by what I was advocating. And I knew they were smart. I had had class with them. When they said that I was believing stupid things that had no evidence, I had to listen a little bit at the beginning, at least, because they weren't anonymous people. They were people who were in a community I cared about. And so that's really the point I would make, that we believe things. We all believe things. And it's kind of easy to dismiss something as being a conspiracy or as being not based in fact, and yet you believe it. And I think that's almost too easy to dismiss, that we all believe things for reasons. And those reasons are usually because it's important to who we are, because it's important to our community, because it is a part of our identity. And so if something is genuinely harmful to society, if it is promoting harm, and we really wanted to change, it doesn't make it any easier to change. Like, if you want to change someone's mind, it's a bit condescending to assume that if you give them better facts that they're going to change their mind. If you tell them they're wrong, they're going to change their mind. The only way that anyone changes beliefs that are core to them is, I would argue, because a community opens up to them, because they expand the scope of who matters to them, and they recognize that there are people I care about who are challenging me, who are saying, I want you to listen to my perspective. I want you to confront something you believe, because I have had a different experience. And if I matter to you, then you need to listen. And I say regularly, I challenge people to show me examples of people who have changed fundamentally things they believe that were not because of new connections in their life that mattered to them. People who mattered to them, who didn't matter before, who now made them confront what they believe. And if we think about it like that, we recognize just how hard it is for someone to change, and why it's so rare, and why it takes so much time.
So we're getting several questions that hit on a central theme that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and that's the relationship between what we saw at the Capitol, the role that religion seems to be playing in some of these developments. There's recent data, and I should say to the audience, I identify as a Pentecostal Christian, but there's data and evidence that is coming out in recent polling showing that white evangelicals in particular seem particularly susceptible to certain fake news, false stories that then have gained traction and then underwrote at least part of what was going on at the Capitol. And we've got two questions that I'll combine together. One from Craig asks about whether your move out of white nationalism could be seen analogous to somebody who's deprogrammed from being raised in a cult. Is that a fair analogy? And then also a question from Jennifer asks, did your faith, if you identify as a person of faith, did that have any role to play in your transformation? And how would you then understand the role of religion as we look now to these difficult moments in democracy?
Right. It's a lot to unpack. And I think I want to start by describing the white nationalist use of religion, that I think we tend to think about the right in America as being largely Christian, largely Protestant, and white nationalism, the far right, is not the same thing. I would argue that for the most part, the white nationalist scene is largely atheist. And when not atheist, it's non-traditionally Christian. There are Christian sects that subscribe to Old Testament dietary laws and believe that Jewish people are pretending to be the Old Testament tribes of Israel, and that it's actually Europeans who are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, and follow kosher laws. There are people who believe in sort of a cosmotheism, the sorts of forms of religion that can exist in the like fringes of political society are wide and varied, and I would say not particularly traditional. My family growing up were atheists, and so I always thought that religion didn't play a role in my life. I will note that I have spent more than a decade studying theology, and it's not the night or the place to get into my theological beliefs, but I think I would sort of compare the experience of growing up in a white nationalist family and a white nationalist political scene as, I don't know about a cult, like maybe, but I didn't grow up in a place separate from society. I grew up in a cosmopolitan urban part of South Florida. It was multiracial. There was a large Jewish community. I was homeschooled after the age of 9, after third grade, because my school was too diverse for what my family liked. But even while I was homeschooled, I went to extracurricular events. I interacted with people who were not white nationalists throughout my entire life. And so I'm not an expert in cults, and so I wonder about making the cult comparison, but I have found a lot of similarities in people who grew up in very extreme religious scenes. And I don't mean this as any sort of way to impugn religious households, but I've encountered people who grown up in very, very fundamentalist Orthodox Jewish communities in New York, where they do not speak English, where the community is told to stay separate from secular people. Then encountered people who were cut off from their families because they no longer believed in the religion that they grew up in. And I think that my experience is obviously not exactly the same as that, but it's hard for me to find too many other situations where what we believe is what ties us together as a family. When I condemned white nationalism, there was real conversation where I argued to my father that there's something else tying us together other than politics, other than our ideology. And his response was, what in your experience being a member of this family has taught you that there is something tying us together other than our beliefs? And that is an experience that I think is not always is not common outside of maybe religions or maybe cults, I don't know, but belief and ideology driving who you are. And I really can't comment on evangelical politics. It's just not something I'm particularly educated about.
I think it's a helpful answer because it also speaks to some of the assumptions that people have about how these groups overlap or intersect. And I think it's insightful to say, look, what we might assume about white nationalists being Christian warriors, in fact, the religious identity is more complicated than that. And I think it's helpful. Again, I say that as a Christian who also thinks there's resources in a variety of traditions that can help us stand for justice, rather than thinking, any one of these is the only way forward. So there's an interesting perspective that you have, given that at 10 years old, from what I understand, you wrote the HTML code for the children's version of Stormfront. And I heard Eli at one point talk about the fact that this may give you pause, thinking like, how many of these kids did your work radicalize in now, marching in Charlottesville or on the Capitol? And we've got a question about the role of social media, the role of, the internet in creating a kind of normalizing function where this is now available and easy to access, and it can be something that, is seductive in ways that maybe 30, 40 years ago would have required some work to get with people holding these views. Now it's kind of everywhere. Do you see that rise of social media is making the movement have more traction, gaining normalization? How do you see the role of the technology in allowing these ideas to spread? And in particular, right, it seems like that the insurrection was rallied via internet communications.
Right. It is definitely true that the internet has increased the ability for white nationalists and all social movements to organize, to find each other, to connect in ways that it was much, much more difficult before. White nationalism, I don't believe it actually changed dramatically when it went online. It's important to note that the white nationalist movement was online and well connected long before most of mainstream society was. In the 1980s, it was very common for dial-up bulletin boards to host newsletters and communications for white nationalists who would dial up using their telephone lines and interface with computers around the country and post messages. before the web was available. And then when the web came online, my dad created the first white nationalist website. He converted a dial-up bulletin board community that he had into the website storefront and created the first home for white nationalists to connect on the web. But all of that communication existed before. The messages were transmitted in newsletters. You can see old documentaries where people talk about Betamax and VHS tapes being the wave of the future. Like now we can take the media into our own hands. But the web made it faster. The web made it possible for you to find people anywhere, or more likely for them to find you from anywhere. And then that network could grow exponentially. And so I think it's a complex back and forth that it's not the case. I don't believe it's the case that in the early days of the web or in these days now where everyone is connected and people talk to each other at light speed constantly, the ideas exist in the physical world. The ideas have a long history. The ideas and the ideology was created decades before now. And what is being facilitated is the ability for people to communicate, for people to put together an event much faster, to get the word out about where they're going to go, what time they're going to be there, to spread news faster. Things move faster. And that can obviously be a huge threat. We see it in acts of violence. We see it in the insurrection at the Capitol, facilitated entirely online. But a lot of parts of that were very traditional. The Capitol insurrection happened because the president called for people to come. He did not explicitly say break into the windows of the Capitol, but he said come to DC and stop the democratic process of Congress officiating the Electoral College. And that is something that would have happened with or without the web. And I think we should actually think about the complexity. There's a real temptation to say the internet produces these movements. The internet brainwashes people. And I think it's a lot more complex. I think it is the case that people believe things and seek out others who also believe them. And then once they're connected, they ramp each other up. Two people who believe the same thing, who sit in a room together, are not going to come out equal. They're going to come out more extreme than they were before they talked each other into it. And that is a process that's existed before, but now happens faster and on a larger scale. And so this is a convoluted answer to something that I think we need to be a bit more nuanced. There's a real temptation to say this is not real in some ways. This is not something that exists in the real world. This is not something that people would have believed without the internet. And that's absolutely not true.
And speaking of nuance, what do you say to someone who, as a result of the Capitol insurrections and many events over the last several years, would say, look, there's a dangerous slide to now use the phrase white nationalism to apply too broadly to those who fall on the conservative political theoretical spectrum. If you are a conservative in the world, that doesn't necessitate that you are a white nationalist. And yet white nationalism being responsible for certain types of behavior with certain high profile instances like the insurrection, is there a danger of that being applied inappropriately, too widely, and actually making the kinds of conversations that you're advocating, the kind of transformation that you exemplify, harder? Because we're now dismissing those who now we've associated or affiliated in ways that may not rightly apply. How would you respond to that sort of worry?
Right. I would first say that in my specific case, I define white nationalism very narrowly. I define it as a social movement of people who are a part of the same history, who have the same heroes, who know each other, who subscribe to white nationalist publications, who in some way have made a step to identify themselves as part of a social movement. I don't identify it as just throw it at anyone who hates immigration or throw it at anyone who says racist things about Black communities. And so white nationalism, I think, probably does get used a bit too broadly. I think it should apply to this social movement that has decades of history and can teach us a lot about how racism functions in our politics if we understand it as that social movement. if we're talking about words like racism or white supremacy, which I think do apply to broader society, that are not words that should only be used to talk about this specific social movement, then I think it's kind of an interesting question, because for a long time, I didn't use the word racist when I was speaking publicly, because I was so used to my family sort of laughing it off. When people would call us racist, we would say, obviously we're not racist, because we understood that as just a bad word. It means you're a bad person. And we were clear, we weren't bad people. We didn't even want anything bad for anyone. Like, we would tell ourselves that. And so racism was just an insult. And that sort of lessened the fact that anybody who is advocating something that then gets called racist is not going to listen to it. They're not going to say, oh my God, you've called me racist. Let me like really engage with this. And I've gotten a little bit more comfortable using it in a sense of policies and a sense of outcomes, which I think we all should be comfortable identifying racial injustice. We have more cases of it than we should at all feel comfortable with. It pervades our society. Criminal courts give Black people and other people of color harsher sentences than white people. Police violence is higher against people of color. The wealth gap between white and Black families is incredibly high, 10 times, and is growing. These are cases of racial injustice that we have to recognize if we are going to be honest with what we know about society are based in racist policies. You may be able to say they come from the past and it's a legacy, which is debatable. Like, there's plenty of racist policy currently in our society. But if we're not able to identify that, if we're not able to say an injustice, an inequality, an outcome that is harming one community over another is based in race, then we're just lying to ourselves about the fact that we live in a society where a racist hierarchy exists and affects all of our lives. And I would say negatively affects all of our lives, including white people. If we live in a society where more resources are allocated to people who are identified as white, that may seem like that's a great situation for you if you're identified as white. If you're born and everybody recognizes you as white, and it means that you have more access to getting into universities and getting better jobs and the sort of network that exists, I would counter that and say, living in a society that is so unfair, that is so unjust, that because of your birth, the access, the opportunities, the way people are going to treat you is decided based on your birth, is not a society you want to live in. That is an unstable society that will never be kind, will never be fair, will never be a fully safe society, because it is so unequal. And so those are the situations where I think we need to be able to use racist. I think it's fair to not call people racist, because a person is different in the morning than they are in the evening. But policies, outcomes, structures, these are all things that disproportionately affect you based on what race you're categorized in America. And if we can't say that the fact that our society holds up white people as the best and allocates more resources to white people as the best, and that's white supremacy, then what are we doing?
As the Black liberation theologian James Cone reminds us that, slavery is America's original sin. And only once we take stock of what that looks like as, inherited in our ways of making sense of the world now, could we ever begin to make sense of, as Kendi points out, right? And you say that ironically, in this case, Abram Kendi and your father agree that the phrase, "I'm not racist, but," ends up doing this really, really difficult work of normalizing the very hatred that then would otherwise be condemned in explicit ways. And that then becomes this, very hard thing to attack, because it goes invisibly underneath the surface of what it is that we're then attending to. Maybe as a final question, before we invite our students to join us again for a panel, let me bring it from the Capitol. We've been to the colleges of South Florida. We've traveled around the world with you doing this anti-racist work. What do you say to, this is coming from Jocelyn asking a question, who says, why should folks care about the white nationalists in their classrooms? In other words, what is it that, you know, if the roles had been reversed, if you know, it wasn't you who was the person being condemned by the majority of the student body, but invited to Shabbat dinner by Matthew and engaged by Allison, what if in fact you had been Allison, or you had been one of those people? Even more pressingly, you had been a student of color or a Jewish student who saw, you know, what was going on as a real threat to you, your identity, your background, your history. Why should we care about white nationalists in our classrooms? As a final question before we turn to our students.
I think that the campus community I was in, largely made the correct assessment, saying that they were going to prioritize making students of color feel welcomed in their community. That the activists especially, were very clear that they had a white supremacist in their campus, and it was not their priority to do outreach to try to change my mind. Their priority was saying these dehumanizing beliefs that I was representing are not what our campus is going to be about. And white nationalism says whole swaths of people are not welcomed, are different, don't belong, and we reject it. We want people to be welcomed here. We reject dehumanizing language. And I would say, and I do say, that is an effective part of persuasion. Like, it did not feel like it at the time to be condemned, like it was going to change my mind. Like, my reaction initially was to go even deeper into my beliefs and go hang out with my community and organize a conference around it. But the fact that I cared about that community, that was making it so clear that I was harming them, was the only reason that I was willing to engage and have these private conversations. And so for most people, I think the answer is you assert the values of your community. You make it clear that your community members are welcome, or should feel safe. The ones who are threatened, the ones who are marginalized, are welcomed here. And by doing that, maybe you don't change people's minds. I think there was no guarantee that anybody was going to change my mind, especially people who didn't know me. But without that, I never would have engaged in the conversations. And if you're Allison or Matthew, the people who are really reaching out to me in private, then you're in kind of a different situation. Then you need to decide, are you going to engage? Do you have a good faith argument? Like, was I willing to listen to them? And because I was, they chose to engage and to do that work. But it was not the case that the people who condemned me were like failing or were not responsible for me coming out the other side the way I did. I think that they were the first thing that was essential. And so, you know, if you find yourself in that situation and you're asserting anti-racism, you're saying, I don't condone this, and in fact, I condemn it, you're doing good work too. That it's not that you're like pushing us backwards or something. That's what most people can do.
So as I invite the students to join us, we have a poll for all of our audience that actually has been set up quite nicely by Derek's last answer. And the poll simply asks, should we seek to engage those whose views we find morally repugnant? Now, before answering, realize both options here are complicated. He's described yes and no are relevant in certain ways. So we've given you the option to say it depends, and that communities matter and embodied life does too. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this before we turn into our panel discussions. And I'd say welcome to our students, Catherine, Kwamik. We are so glad to have you. Ingrid, it's wonderful to see you. The votes are coming in hot and fast here. And what is emerging is that we've got a clear commitment to the importance of it depends, which a brilliant colleague of mine, Dr. Sarah Worth, says that the only real philosophical answer to any question is, well, it depends, because you've got to know some more. So the responses from the poll are certainly coming in. We've got a lot of yeses coming in, a few no's. So we've got 608 votes. And the responses are yes, 356 for it depends, 233 for yes, and 19 for no. And importantly, all of those responses are legitimate responses. And that's something I do hope as we now turn to the students. Students, I think one of the things that we can take from tonight, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is the idea that maybe what Derek has invited us to think about as concerns not only the Capitol insurrection, but the difficulty of social life, is we've got to figure out that there's not only one way to do this work. What matters is that we are committed to virtue, justice, and the dignity of all others, not necessarily that all of our embodied locations make the response identical in all situations. To start off, Kwamik, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how do you, as the president of the NAACP, as a philosophy student, somebody who thinks deeply about the world, how do you go about navigating a world where disagreement and polarization seems to be just ubiquitous? How do we do this, and how have you found successful in your life?
One of the main things I do, just based off of my experience and things, is I've learned to be more open-minded. And like you said, I think it takes an open mind to truly be able to learn anything, because if you have your closed-minded person, you're absolutely committed to this one idea, and you're willing to say, well, this person is saying is invalid and I just won't listen to that. I think that's honestly your first mistake, because then you don't have a way to be able to understand that perspective. I think it's important that we try and understand where that person is coming from. I try and understand, what is their social background? What is their upbringing? How could you, if this is illogical to me, your beliefs, I'm trying to figure out, how did you get there? Because if we figure out how did you get there, then I have a good strategy to be able to say, okay, what do I need to do to dismantle this? What do I have to show you? What do I have to tell you for me to be able to have a better idea of, how can I work on these different things? So I think it's just truly being willing to be open and listen to what others have to say and understand their perspective before you try and make any more moves. Because some people, you got to change hearts and minds. And I think that's something that Dr. King said. You can't just change a person's mind without changing their heart first. So I think if you understand that person, and like you said, you have that real connection and you're truly trying to do the work, then I just feel like you should try and understand where that person is coming from and how did they get there.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote where she says, people will forget what you did, they'll forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And it speaks, of course, in both directions, right? Hatred, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, these are things that actually hurt people. They rob the dignity of others. And what it looks like to navigate a world where that is all too real is extremely complicated. So thank you, Kwamik. You're such a good philosopher. Ingrid, I'd like to turn to you. And maybe you could comment on what you see as the experience that you've navigated. You mentioned you're a first-generation Mexican-American. How is it that you have found college to be a space of engagement? Has it been a welcoming space, a critical space? Derek comments that college is where his identity was shaken and also invited to be transformed. I'd love to get your perspective on how you have found college to speak to these ideas.
Yeah, so actually, thinking back of my decision of coming to Furman, where it's a predominantly white school, was a very it was a tough decision I came to. I had grown up in a minority high school. I had been surrounded by ideas. So for me, deciding to come to Furman, I was willing to put myself in a vulnerable situation, which I think is one of the things that has really shaped my way of seeing myself as part of the society. As such, I found myself breaking away from a lot of perspectives that I've had growing up, and being part of the Hispanic community. Sometimes we tend to be put in this square, this box, and over the years, I've just come to realize that sometimes it's not so much that they don't like people like me, or people don't like me because of my color, but it's just it has been mentioned earlier today. They haven't gotten a chance to care for someone like me. And that's, I've realized that I just don't really engage in ways where I feel that I'm disrespecting them first. And I sort of allow them to feel that I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt.
So powerful. Speaking to the vulnerability that defines our finite existence is just so crucial for understanding, what it looks like to have a shared hope, right? The beloved community is one not where we are invulnerable, but one where we appreciate and care for the vulnerabilities of others. I'm so glad that you shared those words of wisdom with us, Ingrid. Catherine, I would love to hear your thoughts about what Derek has commented tonight and the way he's tried to nuance some of these distinctions, because it is the case that there are reasons to think that the political realities are ones that can make it hard to self-identify in certain ways for lots of people. And yet it is interesting to hear now, certain people who may embody all kinds of privilege feeling like that they are now the ones who are being oppressed, right? There's Eli Saslow comments all the time that it's shocking to him that nearly 40% of white people think that they are the more victimized than people of color. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in response to Derek's description of how it is that white nationalism, his story, speaks to where you find your own.
Yeah, I just want to say before I begin, thank you guys for having us on tonight. Thank you to the Riley Institute. It's really great to have this kind of conversation. So listening to Derek present on his experience of white nationalism and what that looks like and how that affects our greater society, I really appreciated some of his thoughts on how we talk about others and how we label others in the context of that. I think that one of the frustrating things coming out of the Capitol riots for me was seeing labels being applied in places that seemed too general and too broad for the situation. However, I think it's really curious to look at this group that participated in the insurrection at the Capitol and see some of their reasoning behind it. I think a lot of the sentiments seemed to be disenfranchisement from just what was going on. They felt like, it seems as if they felt like their votes were being disregarded in favor of what they were hearing from the other side of the political spectrum. So I personally am not sure exactly where that sentiment was coming from, other than just looking at Congress and hearing some of the rhetoric coming from lawmakers who might be in opposition, and seeing how these individuals might feel as if their voices are being squashed in some way. So I think it's important to have conversations like what we're having tonight, where we can hear from a variety of different voices, and I appreciate just everyone's willingness to be here and speak to that.
Thank you so much. And it's important to understand, just in case it wasn't clear, I want to make sure I clear up any ambiguity. The idea that white people are experiencing discrimination in the way that they perceive it is actively false, right? So the idea is not, oh, we've got to now start being concerned about the 40% who are experiencing this way. And one of the things that Derek, it discusses in the book, of course, is the fact that when you had to be around people who had experiences that were marginalized in ways that then revealed your own privilege, right? It interrupts the narrative of being able to say, well, my experiences are the only ones that are impactful. And one of the things, Catherine, that I appreciated about the way you narrated your video at the beginning is to say, just because there is discrimination and active racism and a history of violation, it is important for us also to recognize that when we speak from an admission of our histories, right, this makes possible a real opportunity for shared growth. So Kwamik, you are leading the way, and I would walk with you anywhere. Ingrid, I would link arms and stand with you any day of the week and listen to your story, because it will make mine way more compelling if I learn to be silent and hear from the voices of others. Catherine, continue to stand for what you take to matter, and let's all remember that when we stand with each other, we recognize the shared dignity that unites us, so that democracy is not something that we look back on so that we try to be great like we used to be, which is an origin narrative that marginalizes far too many of our fellow citizens. But instead, we can look forward to a democracy and justice to come, the beloved community toward which Martin Luther King pointed, not one that he looked back in a desire to return, but instead invited us forward together. Let me, on behalf of the Riley Institute, on behalf of Furman University, Derek, thank you for being with us. We're so glad to have you the second time. Thank you for the story of your transformation and for doing what you call not courage, but simply the duty that you have to speak out. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you, Kwamik, Ingrid, Catherine. Thank you for being willing to be part of this, to all the staff that organized it, and also to the community members, the students, the alums who were part of this conversation. These are hard topics, but they are the kinds of topics that require us to be able to learn when to speak, when to be silent, and how to do both in a vision of mutual dignity. Thank you all so much. I wish you well. Have a wonderful evening.